let's just review a little bit from last time. So we have this idea of evidentiary worth. This is for inductive probative arguments, right? This is basically how good are the premises? How much evidence do the premises give us to believe that the conclusion is true? And we said that this had sort of two components to it. So first thing, if the premises are true, we need to figure out how much work they actually do to establish that the conclusion is true. This is sort of roughly maybe analogous to the idea of validity in deductive logic. And there's also the question of how credible are the premises? How likely are they to be true? And again, that's maybe analogous to the truth question in deductive problems. These are sort of the two things that go into it. It doesn't really matter how much work premises would do if they are not true. Conversely, it doesn't matter if they're true if they don't do much work. So both need to be there. The fallacies of illusory support, which are what we talked about last week, these are cases where the premises offer us no reason to believe that the conclusion is true. So the problem is with this first criteria, in effect, right? Even if the premises are true, they just don't do any work at all. So we also called them fallacies of irrelevancy. Today, we have two other classes of fallacies. So we have the fallacies of minimal support. These are where the premises do give us some reason to believe the conclusion is true, but just not very much reason. They do work, but they don't do enough work to really justify the results. So again, those fallacies are still dealing with this first condition, with this first criteria. And most of the ones we'll talk about today, I think the first 6 we're going to talk about today are all fallacies of minimal support. But then there's also fallacies of unacceptability that we'll end today with. These are premises that lack credibility, but they're presented in such a way that they sort of seem as if they are credible. So if you want to think of all these kinds of fallacies as trick arguments, the trick in the fallacies of minimal support is getting you to sort of believe stuff that's not super important is really important. And the trick in the fallacies of unacceptability is getting you to believe that stuff that's probably not true is true. Right? That's the nature of the trick in both cases. Let's begin with our fallacies of minimal support. And the first of these that we're going to talk about is what's called the ad hominem fallacy. So just a real quick reminder, the way you should go about answering these problems on an exam, first, define what the fallacy is. Then second, explain how the argument does or does not commit the fallacy. And that's what I'll try to do in all the examples that I go through today too. It's how I'll try to sort of talk about them, begin with a definition, then go into sort of the explanation about how the argument specifically does the thing that's in the fallacy. So let's start with what are called the ad hominem fallacies. So ad hominem is a Latin phrase, it just means to the person or at the person or at the man. So let's just define it. So an ad hominem fallacy is any argument that rejects some position because of the person who advances the position. As a result, it's going to be similar to, but slightly different from the guilt by association fallacy, which is a fallacy of illusory support. And so we'll look at some examples of how they're different as we sort of go. But the basic idea of this kind of argument is that it's always about dismissing something. Right? You dismiss what someone says because of who they are in some way. And the reason why these are fallacies of minimal support is that indeed, it well might be the case that certain kinds of people are unreliable, that they say false things a lot of the time, that's entirely possible, that they're not trustworthy. But normally speaking, we'd be better served by analyzing the argument that a person is presenting rather than the person who presents the argument, right? So it's maybe slightly relevant, but not very much. Because all kinds of bad people, again, bad broadly speaking, believe things that are true and can good reasons for believing things that are true. Even hypocrites, so even say someone who does the exact opposite of what they're saying, that doesn't mean that what they're saying is false. We'd be better served by just analyzing what it is that they actually say. The two kinds of ad hominem fallacies that we're going to talk about in particular are the abusive ad hominem and the circumstantial. So let's do the abusive first. This is where you reject what the person says because they're a bad person. And bad in something of a moral sense, or something kind of like something resembling a kind of moral sense of bad, right? You kick puppies, so I don't care what you have to say about foreign policy. Something like that would be an example of the abusive ad hominem. Or let's look at the example I came up with. Is this zoomed in well enough and clear enough? Everyone can read this. Any questions? Or need this to be made larger? All right. So the example I came up with, Fred argues that we should raise taxes, but he's a serial killer, so we shouldn't listen to anything that he has to say. Right? This is committing the abusive ad hominem argument. Fred is a bad person, right? And so we can dismiss his tax views. But, you know, lots of bad people have indeed good things to say, useful things to say in many cases. So we'd be better off served just trying to figure out why Fred thinks we should raise taxes rather than caring that he's a serial killer, at least, again, with respect to this position of whether or not taxes should or should not be raised. Right. Before we start talking about or contrasting how that kind of argument is different from the guilt by association fallacy, any questions just with the example or with the definition that I gave? All right, let's talk about the difference. Because guilt by association was kind of similar too, right? Guilt by association also sort of seemed like it was a case where we were sort of rejecting a position because of people being bad people. All right, so let's contrast these two arguments. So here's the example we used from last class for guilt by association. All right, so person A says that we should raise taxes. Oh, well, you know, Fred, the serial killer, says the exact same thing. This is guilt by association because we're not attacking the person who's saying we should raise taxes. Now, the way person B is attacking the idea of raising taxes is by saying some other dude also thought it and he was a serial killer, right? But we're not saying that person A themselves is the serial killer. We're not attacking the person who's advancing the argument specifically. So for an ad hominem, you would have to be attacking person A rather than what's going on, which is what's going on here, right? We're attacking Fred, the person making the argument because he's a serial killer, rather than attacking the idea of raising taxes because serial killers just happen to have been people who thought it in the past. All right. So any questions about this distinction? Any questions about any feature of what an abusive ad hominem is, or any examples that anyone came up with that you'd like to try out for today? All right, then let's move on then to the circumstantial ad hominem. So it's still an ad hominem argument. It still has the same basic structure. But the reason why we're rejecting what the person says is different. So this is where what someone says gets rejected because of features of who the person is. Almost always, this will sound something like, of course, someone like you says that. And so it's frequently just used to dismiss people because of, say, the kind of person that they are. So not necessarily saying that they're a bad person or that these are bad, it's bad to be the kind of person that you are. But then nevertheless, what you say can be rejected. So say you might see this in the context of something like some kind of sexism, right? Like, oh, well, you're just a woman, so of course you say things like that. That would be an example of a circumstantial ad hominem. And maybe a racial attack, right? You're black, so you say something of that. So of course, you'll say things like that. That would be ad hominem. But it can also occur in all kinds of arenas. It can occur like in context, right? Like, of course you say philosophy is really important, Paul, you're a philosophy professor. Right? That too would be an example of a circumstantial ad hominem. Features of me, features of my background make it so you just don't have to kind of take it seriously when I say things that I say about philosophy, for example. The example I came up with for the assignment: we should raise taxes. It will fund vital government services. Person B responds, of course you say that. You are poor, so your taxes wouldn't go up. Right? Because of a feature like you, there's a feature of you, we don't have to take what you say seriously. That would be example of a circumstantial ad hominem. All right. So we're going to need to add a slight bit of nuance, but again, before we do, any questions about the definition or about the example? All right, let's look then at this other example. So what about this argument? So this product is safe to eat according to person A. Take my word for it. Person B responds, you are only saying that because the company that makes it is paying you to say that. Right. Is that a circumstantial ad hominem argument? What do you think? Think about it for a minute or two. Does this seem as if it is an unreliable form of argumentation? I would actually say I don't think this does. Even though it looks a lot like it. Okay. And so why does it look like it first? It's the same kind of idea, right? I'm saying a feature of person A, in this case, a feature of the company they work for, makes it so that I can dismiss what they say about the product. What's different in this case is that the credibility of the person who's making the argument is a crucial part of the argument itself. This is what's called an appeal to authority argument. Person A literally just says, take my word for it, trust me, right? You imagine that maybe they're a scientist, right? And that they've run a bunch of complicated tests that maybe the average person couldn't understand. And so they're saying that, yeah, you know, I tested it, take my word for it, right? Well, hold on a second. If they're not being objective, or if they're being biased, or if they have a conflict of interest, that is quite relevant to whether or not we should take their word for it. It's quite relevant to the argument that they're advancing. Whereas if we go back to the first example, right, we should raise taxes because it will fund vital services, A's objectivity or their knowledge or their partiality or their biases, that's not part of their argument at all. Their argument is it'll fund vital government services. We can analyze and evaluate that claim regardless of whether or not they'll be benefited by the increase in taxation, right? Or at least that they won't be harmed by it. Right? And so as a result, we can look at person A's argument in this first case without talking about who person A is. Because the person A is making an appeal to authority in this case, it won't be possible to analyze the appeal without talking about who person A is. Are they biased in some sort of problematic sense? So not everything that looks like a circumstantial ad hominem will be. They'll only take place where the argument is actually indeed not really depending on who the person is, like in this first argument. All right. So any examples that you all came up with that you want to try out? Any questions about either of the two examples we've talked about so far?
I have an example.
Go ahead.
I said that Jimmy says that we should abandon all laws of society, but Jimmy's an ex-felon, so we shouldn't listen to what he has to say.
That would work. Absolutely. That would absolutely work. Because, you know, what we should probably do instead of that argument, we should probably look at his reasons for wanting to abolish all the laws of society, and then we'll figure out if those reasons are good or are they bad. Right? Since we have that as an option, we should prefer it to just dismissing it because he's the ex-felon, as you say. That example works well. Good. Any other examples anyone wants to try out? All right. Then let's move on to the fallacy of popularity. Again, this one's going to sound a little bit like a fallacy we talked about last week. It's going to sound like the two wrongs fallacy a little bit. So let's introduce the fallacy, and then again, we'll talk a little bit what the difference is, how it's different than two wrongs. So the fallacy of popularity is any argument that says that something is true because lots of people believe that it's true. And the second condition is important, and there's no reason to think that the average person is sort of qualified to evaluate whether or not the original claim was true. And both conditions need to be there. Simply the fact that lots of people believe something, that's not enough for an argument to commit the fallacy of popularity. There's lots of times when a lot of people believing something is indeed a good reason to believe that something is true. If lots of people in the United States believe that the capital of the United States is Washington, D.C., well, guess what? There's good reason to think that they're right. Or maybe it's if I go to France and I don't know what the capital of France is, and I ask a bunch of random French people, hey, what's the capital of France? And they all tell me Paris. There's good reason to believe that the average person on the streets in Paris or know what the capital is within France. Right? But there's no reason to believe that the average person in Paris knows what the capital of Uzbekistan is. Say. So a lot of people telling me, oh, the capital of Uzbekistan is X, Y, and Z, that doesn't have any weight because there's no reason to believe that the average person in France will know what the capital of Uzbekistan actually is. So let's look at the example that I came up with for this one that's hopefully relatively clear. So for this one, go with either global warming is or is not happening. They actually both commit the fallacy either way. So global warming is happening. Everyone says that it is. But figuring out that whether or not global warming is happening, excuse me, sorry, is actually a really technically complicated task, right? I mean, there are indeed people who study exhaustively the question of whether or not global warming is or is not taking place, and they're climate scientists, right? They're the people who would possess the relevant expertise needed to evaluate that claim. I have a doctorate, right? In philosophy. That doesn't mean that even with all my training and education that I would be qualified to actually determine for myself whether or not global warming is taking place, right? There are indeed experts. The average person is not one of them. So in this case, this argument, either side would be committing the fallacy because the general person on the street is simply not particularly qualified to determine whether or not global warming is or is not happening. All right, so we'll talk now about how this differs from the two wrong fallacy. But before we do, I just wanted to check in again. Any questions on either how I defined it or on any of the examples that I've given of it so far? All right, so the two wrongs fallacy almost looks like sort of a special case of it. It looks really similar. So this is an example we talked about last class. So speeding isn't immoral. Why? Because everyone speeds. Everyone does it. It seemingly has the same basic structure of the fallacy of popularity. But this is actually not really the fallacy of popularity. This is the two wrongs fallacy. The reason why is because it's explicitly a moral argument. And what the average person or what people in general do is just irrelevant morally, as we talked about last class. In contrast, this first example, it's a fallacy of popularity. right? It's not a moral context. And so the fact that a lot of people believe something, it has some relevance to whether or not global warming is happening. It just doesn't have very much, right? So two wrongs is a fallacy of irrelevancy or a fallacy of illusory support. It's just irrelevant that everyone speeds. Whereas there are indeed scenarios where the fact that a lot of people believe something gives me some reason to believe that the thing is true, even if it's not very much, right? Maybe the reason why everyone is saying that global warming is happening is because they've heard it from experts, from climate scientists. Then them repeating what they've heard climate scientists are saying would have some relevance, even if it'd be far more authoritative just to actually go to the experts and see what it is that the experts are saying. So fallacy of popularity is basically when we're not looking at sort of a moral context. Two wrongs fallacy is when we're looking at this in the kind of moral arena, moral context. All right. Any questions about any of the examples or any examples you've come up with that you want to try out and test? What about this argument? Is this argument committing the fallacy? The new James Bond movie is really good. Lots of people have told me it is. Is that argument committing the fallacy? I would actually say it's probably not. I would actually say that that example is actually probably not really committing the fallacy. And the reason why is that the average person has at least some competency to judge whether or not a movie is good or bad. Maybe we could say that there are movie critics or whatever who are more authoritative. Fine, that's reasonable. But in general, whether or not people had a good time at a movie, whether or not they liked the movie, that is something that the average person at least seems if they can meaningfully contribute to. And so if a lot of people are telling me this movie is pretty good, I mean, think of this sort of practically, right? These are arguments that we use all the time in the course of figuring things out in the world. And if a bunch of people say, hey, this movie's really good, I'll probably check it out. And it doesn't seem like I'm being irrational to do so, right? Because sort of the average person can have something useful and meaningful to say about whether or not a movie is good or bad. The average person has very little useful or meaningful to say about whether we should prefer the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics to the many worlds interpretation, right? And so the specific time when you're going to see the fallacy of popularity is where the average person just really doesn't have much useful to say about the topic that's being described or the topic under investigation. All right. So any questions or examples people want to try out? All right, then let's move on to our next fallacy. So next one, we're going to do these next two together. We have the hasty generalization and the anecdotal evidence fallacy. We'll do hasty generalization first because basically anecdotal evidence is just a specialized version. So a generalization is anytime you move from talking about sort of like a small number of things that are within some population to talking about an entire population. So a sort of classic example from philosophy of a generalization is, let's say I've seen hundreds, maybe I've seen thousands of swans in my life, and all of them have been white. And I conclude from the basis of that all swans are white. Right? Or maybe I've looked at hundreds of examples of ancient philosophy texts, and I've never found the notion of moral personhood within them. And so I conclude that there is no notion of moral personhood in ancient philosophy. Right? I look at a bunch of instances of something and then form a generalization about what's true of the whole population from the small sample of the population that I've looked at. A hasty generalization is where you haven't looked at enough members of the population to make a reliable generalization. So if I've looked at thousands of swans and they've all been white swans, that's probably reasonably good evidence to infer that probably all, or at least the overwhelming majority of swans are white. Right? Not a certain argument. Remember, these are inductive arguments, so new evidence could change things. But at least that would be a reasonable inference because I've looked at so many swans. If I've only looked at 1 or 2 swans, though, I think you'd want to say I haven't looked at enough swans to reliably gauge what's true about all of them. Right? Another context where we see hasty generalizations is frequently in things like consumer reports. So say like, I buy an iPhone and it breaks on me, right? My one bad experience with an iPhone isn't enough to really allow me to reliably generalize that iPhones in general are unreliable phones. I would need to look at a lot more iPhones to reach a reliable generalization. If I only looked at 1 or 2, that would be a hasty generalization. So the example that I came up with for hasty generalizations, right? Very much like the one we just said, my Subaru died right after I bought it. Thus, Subarus are a very unreliable car. True story. That actually happened to me. My car died 1 week after buying it. Right? But it's entirely possible that I just got a lemon. I was just really unlucky. Maybe 99.9% of the time, the cars work fine. To really figure out how reliable Subarus as a whole are, I would have to look at way more of them than just the one that I had a bad experience with. Anecdotal evidence fallacy is a specialized version of hasty generalization. So let's turn to that one real fast. Sorry, that was the wrong board. Come back. The anecdotal evidence fallacy is where you come to a hasty generalization as a result of overprivileging your own experience. So all instances of hasty anecdotal evidences or fallacies are also going to be instances of the hasty generalization fallacy, right? And we'll see that the example that we just looked at also commits the anecdotal evidence fallacy. Right? My Subaru died right after I bought it, thus Subarus are very unreliable. I'm overprivileging my own one bad experience with the car and forming a generalization on its basis. So this does both. It's both hasty generalization and anecdotal evidence. Whereas let's look at this second example. A recent survey of 3 people who bought Subarus discovered that one of the cars died within a month of the purchase. So Subarus have a 33% failure rate and are very unreliable. Here, this is just committing the hasty generalization. Here, I'm just not looking at enough cars to reach a judgment about how reliable Subarus are in general, at least not any kind of reliable judgment about them, right? Because I've only looked at 3. Again, if I just got really unlucky and one of the 3 people I surveyed got a lemon, I can get wildly skewed data. Maybe the next 100 people I'm going to talk to, their cars didn't fail. And so this 33% was just an accident. So it's a hasty generalization, but I'm not making the mistake as a result of overprivileging my own experience, right? I don't have any, in this example, I don't have any experience with Subarus. My experience with them is coming from a survey, right? And so it's not committing the anecdotal evidence fallacy, whereas in the first case, I was relying on my own experience, so that's why it was anecdotal evidence fallacy as well, or 2. All right. So any thoughts about how we've defined either of these fallacies? Any questions about any of the examples that we've given so far, or any examples of either of them that you want to try out?
I have one for the anecdotal evidence.
Mhm.
I said that I've bought lottery tickets like 10 times and I haven't won any money, so I'll never win anything.
Yeah, that would be the anecdotal evidence fallacy, though it's also probably a true conclusion, but not a good reasoning to lead you to the true conclusion. Because yeah, you're 10 times with it. That's probably not enough to gauge that it's sort of impossible to discover. We have someone in the chat throwing an option up. So the argument someone in the chat is suggesting, I do not believe sexism still exists in America. I'm a man and have never been sexist to a woman in my life. Perfect. That probably is both anecdotal evidence and hasty generalization. Right? It commits both fallacies. One, because, say I'm the person saying the argument, I'm a sample size of one. That's not enough to gauge what's true about the population of maybe men in general. Right? And it's anecdotal evidence because I'm over-privileging my one experience, right? And giving that too much weight, right? Not looking at other people who have maybe experienced very different things than me. Yeah, so that works really well. It also could have worked if I'm a woman and I've never experienced sexism. That would also do it too. Again, I'd be over-privileging my own one experience, right? Not looking at people who've had different experiences than me. So good. Yeah, that example works too. Any other examples people want to try out? All right, then let's keep moving on. Let's go to the arguments for the absence of evidence. Oh, by the way, let's actually real fast back to the last one. On the exam, I'm not really going to care about the difference between hasty generalization and anecdotal evidence fallacy that much. So you don't need to worry about it too much. You can frequently just pick one of them, and that'll be fine. Just so long as if it really is an instance of anecdotal, if you're saying that it is. Otherwise, you can always just say hasty generalization actually, and not have to worry about it. But just make sure that if it is really anecdotal, but otherwise you can pick either of the two. I'd be fine with either of them in terms of explanations. All right, let's go now to the absence of evidence fallacy. And so before we actually talk about this fallacy directly, let's talk about the idea of the burden of proof, because that's basically what the fallacy is going to hinge on. So the idea of the burden of proof is sort of like who has to give evidence for some claim. In an argument, especially if the conclusion is at all controversial, and it should be, like most of the time, that's why we make arguments, is because the conclusion is something controversial. If you're advancing any kind of controversial conclusion in an argument, the burden of proof is on the person making the argument to present evidence for why the conclusion is true. If you want to put it this way, if I'm making an argument that ghosts exist, so that's a controversial claim that ghosts exist. If I'm advancing that argument, the burden of proof is on me, or the responsibility is on me to prove that ghosts exist. I'm the one that's sort of responsible for it. It's my argument. I'm responsible for the conclusion. Right? I have to give you reasons to establish that the conclusion is true. In an argument that commits the absence of evidence fallacy, the burden of proof gets inverted. Right? And any argument that suggests that unless you can prove that my conclusion is false, you're obligated to believe that it's true. I sort of push off my obligation to establish that my conclusion is correct onto you. I suggest that you have some responsibility or obligation to prove that my conclusion is false, otherwise it's true. And it's sort of inverting the point of an argument to the way that arguments are supposed to work. So the example that I came up with for this one, we should raise taxes. You don't have any evidence that it won't work, do you? Right? This argument doesn't give us any reason at all to believe that we should raise taxes. It simply pushes the burden of proof onto you and says, if you can't prove me wrong, I must be right. And so it's sort of failing to do what an argument is supposed to do. It's actually failing to give good reasons to believe that some conclusion is true. We can make this a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more complicated with another example that we'll talk about in a moment. But I just want to pause again first. Just check everyone okay with the definition of the argument from the absence of evidence fallacy and from the examples we've given so far? All right, good. Then let's turn to a little bit of a nuanced case. So what about this argument? Scientists have spent the last century attempting to disprove Einstein's theory of general relativity, and they have failed each time. The theory is thus most likely true. So this seems to have a similar kind of structure. We're saying that there's no evidence to disprove the theory of general relativity. But I want to say that this argument actually doesn't commit the fallacy. And the reason why is that there has been extended, serious effort to prove the theory false, and none of them have worked. That actually kind of does start to seem like positive reason to think that the theory might be true. Hold on just 1 second. A couple people are in the waiting room. Let me add them. Okay. So, go back. All right. So if you have repeated serious efforts to disprove some hypothesis, and they all fail, that does actually start to be evidence that the hypothesis is a good one. And that's what happens in science all the time. Scientific theories are what are called falsifiable. They make predictions about the world. And so you can one way you can sort of work to establish that a theory is correct is you can try to disprove it. You can try to show that its predictions don't come true. And that's kind of what happened with the theory of general relativity, actually. Einstein's theory led to a bunch of predictions. He predicted that like a weird eclipse was going to happen at a certain date. He predicted that like there should be like weird gravitational wave phenomenon as a result of black holes colliding and all these various predictions. If you sort of like study those predictions, try to disprove them, and you fail, that does indeed, it's called the method of confirmation. It does indeed seem as if it's offering some confirmation that the theory was a good one, or the hypothesis was a good one, because its predictions are kind of bearing out. That's not what's taking place here. What's taking place here is completely unserious. Right? The claim is just, if you can't disprove me off the top of your head, I must be right. And that's really the difference in this case. I mean, if we don't have evidence that raising taxes won't work, that is some evidence maybe that we should raise taxes. It's just not very much in and of itself. But if we try it really seriously again and again and again and never find any reasons to not raise taxes, then the accumulated weight of all those failures, of all those negatives, all that absence kind of starts to look a little bit like a positive. So where this is especially a fallacy is where you have a sort of wildly unserious, well, if you can't disprove me off the top of your head, I must be right. All right, so how are we doing with this absence of evidence fallacy? Anyone want to try out some examples? Yeah, and feel free to use the chat too, by the way. That actually works just fine as well. Yeah, someone gave a guess. So in the chat, someone has, well, you can't provide evidence that George Bush didn't cause 9/11, therefore he must have. Yeah, that works perfectly well. That works really well, right? And a lot of conspiracy theory stuff actually. Well, again, near the end of the semester, we'll talk about conspiracy theories a little bit. Like a lot of conspiracy theories tend to fall prey to that fallacy. This fallacy very much so, where you sort of like push the burden of proof off, or some of the JFK stuff, as someone's adding in the chat. Yeah, that would be another scenario where frequently like the burden of proof is just kind of getting shifted. I say something kind of outrageous, and then make it that your job to disprove my outrageous thing, where it's my job to give evidence for my outrageous thing. So yeah, this fallacy is one that very commonly occurs in both conspiracy theories and what we're also going to call extraordinary claims, things like ghosts or whatever, or UFOs. Those are very some clear scenarios where, because people kind of don't have great evidence, they try to shift the burden of proof instead to justify their claim. So yeah, those examples I think work really well. Good. Any others anyone wants to try off? All right, then if no others anyone wants to look at, let's turn to our last of these fallacies of minimal support. So our last fallacy of minimal support, I think we're doing good time-wise. We should be able to get through all of these today. Our last fallacy of minimal support is what's called the slippery slope fallacy. And this comes from actually a real case. There was I believe it comes from the 50s. There was I believe it was a senator. I'm not 100% sure. He could have been just in the House of Representatives. But there was some member of Congress. There was a debate about a minor tax little bill. It was super unimportant. It was like raising taxes on some minor thing by a small little percentage. And the senator sort of like got up, gave this whole speech, and he uttered the phrase, if we raise taxes right now, we'll be on the slippery slope to communism. Right? And this was an archetypical example of this fallacy. So the fallacy sort of got named after that example. The slippery slope fallacy is where you suggest that some argument or proposal is bad because it leads to sort of an outrageous, unlikely bad outcome. And the key reason for why this is a fallacy is that the argument's not really doing any work to establish that this supposedly bad outcome is really likely to happen. So it's just kind of a scare tactic, right? Like, I haven't really established that a slight tax increase, boom, communism the next day, right? But I'm sort of trying to scare you into thinking that there's such a connection, even though I haven't done any work to actually establish what it would be or how we'd get there. Or similarly, another example that I came up with, switch back, right? We should raise taxes, but that will cause a decline in the economy and lead to the collapse of Western civilization. Frequently, in the case of these arguments, the sort of bad outcomes, maybe there's sort of a series of them, and maybe they start off plausible at first, but get more and more implausible as it goes. So is it plausible that raising taxes could cause a decline in the economy? Sure, that's possible. You could also maybe say that it's not true, right? I mean, that hasn't been established either, but it's plausible. It's not crazy. It's not outrageous to say that could be a result. It's in the realm of expected possibilities or expected outcomes. The collapse of Western civilization is not. That is not plausible. That is not within the realm of expected outcomes, things that are likely to follow from a tax increase, right? It's an outrageously bad scenario, but no real work is being done to suggest why raising taxes is going to lead to this disastrously bad outcome, right? And so it would be an example of the slippery slope fallacy. People sometimes struggle to differentiate slippery slope from what's called the straw person fallacy, which we talked about last class. So let's really quickly just work on the distinction. So the example we looked at last class was we should raise taxes. Person B responds, "Why do you want the government to take all my money?" Right. We said that was the straw person fallacy because it misrepresents what person A was actually proposing. Person A wasn't proposing that the government should take all my money. They were proposing that we should raise taxes slightly, right? It's a misrepresentation. That's straw person, and so therefore it's irrelevant because it's not even what anything person A ever said. This is slippery slope, right? It doesn't misrepresent the original proposal. It just draws an implausible result from the proposal. So they're doing very different things, even if sometimes they look similar. And they both are sort of bad ways of arguing against someone. So in that regard, that they're similar, but they're doing very different things. Straw person is a misrepresentation of the position. Slippery slope is getting the consequences of the position wrong, but getting the position correct. You also, I suppose, could do both, right? Like you could both misrepresent the position and then derive a crazy consequence from it. Then you'd be doing both straw person and slippery slope. They'd be two separate mistakes, though. Right? So just work on keeping them clear. Am I distorting the position, or am I just drawing crazy consequences from it without justifying those consequences? All right. So any questions from any of the examples we've talked about for slippery slope, or any examples of your own that you'd like to try out? All right. Doesn't look like any. So now let's turn. Then we're still good time wise. We still should be able to get through the remaining three. So all the ones we've talked about so far today are fallacies of minimal support. They're all fallacies where the premises give you kind of some reason to believe that the conclusion is true. They just don't give you very much. Even in slippery slope, right? It's really unlikely that raising taxes will lead to the end of Western civilization. But I suppose that worry is relevant. It's just probably not very relevant. It's not something we should take super seriously. But so therefore, that's why it's sort of minimal support. The fallacies of unacceptability, which are the next three that we're going to talk about, in contrast, we're not really talking about how much work and the premises do. It's really just going to be a problem with whether or not the premises are true or false. We're going to have sort of no good reason to think that the premise is true. And that therefore gives us a reason to think that the premise doesn't have much evidentiary worth. So the first example of this is probably the one fallacy I see students have the hardest time with. So this is a key one to maybe try out some examples on, because this is the one that I see students sort of mess up the most. It's what's called the problematic premise fallacy. Key thing here, it's the problematic premise, not a problematic conclusion. Don't talk to me about how controversial the conclusion is, or say the conclusion is problematic, because that's just not going to be relevant for this. What's going to be, this is a problem with one premise within an argument. Right. So let's just define the fallacy first, and then we'll talk about a couple different examples of it and try to get clear about what's going on here. Because a little bit, this fallacy kind of reveals a little bit just the basic structure of argumentation itself. So this is any argument where a premise within the argument is as controversial as the conclusion, or even more controversial, then you've got a problematic premise fallacy. And there's two different ways we can characterize this. If the premise is more controversial in general, maybe to a general audience, something like that, we'll say that the premise lacks credibility. If the premise is more controversial to the specific audience that the argument is addressed to, we'll say it lacks acceptability. And either way, in either case, you're looking at the problematic premise fallacy. They sort of come to the same thing. So let's look at maybe a concrete example of this. So let's say I wanted to go before the NRA, so the National Rifle Association, a gun advocacy group in the United States, and I wanted to argue that we need more restrictive gun laws. Right. My conclusion is going to be very controversial to that audience, right? It's an audience that's going to be very reluctant to accept that conclusion. That in and of itself is not a problem. That's, in a sense, always going to be the case. We make arguments when the conclusion is controversial, and we make them to people who don't already agree with us. There's not much point in making an argument to someone who kind of already agrees with you, right? All that's doing is just making yourself feel better or something. Like, usually we make arguments to people who about controversial conclusions when they don't already agree with us. Fine, not a problem. But if the reason I give the members of the NRA to think that we should have more restrictive gun control laws is that everyone who owns a gun is a homicidal maniac, now we've got a problem. That premise is probably way more controversial than the conclusion we should have stricter gun laws. Right? You can think, here's one way you can test this, right? I know lots of people who think we need stricter gun control laws who would not at all agree that everyone who owns a gun is a homicidal maniac. Right? That premise lacks kind of both acceptability and credibility. It's certainly not going to be acceptable to that specific NRA audience. It's also not going to be credible probably to a general audience. So it probably fails sort of both regards, right? In general, there's no good reason to think that premise, all people who own guns are homicidal maniacs, is true. All right, if that was true, would that be a reason to have gun control? Sure, it would be, but there's no reason to think that it is. And so therefore, there's no reason to accept the argument, right? The goal of an argument, you can sort of think like the ideal of how arguments should work is that arguments should work from things that we all agree upon in the premises and use those to get to a conclusion that we didn't start all agreeing on. But if the premises are just as crazy to someone as your conclusion, you've given them no actual reason to accept your conclusion. Right? The premise needs to be sort of something that we can all agree upon, or at least something that close to we can all agree upon. That then we can actually get somewhere toward advancing the conclusion. Here's an example, another example that I came up with of this. So it is wrong to kill animals for meat because the lives of non-human animals are far more valuable than the lives of humans. I'm a vegetarian, so I endorse this conclusion, but I don't endorse it for this reason. Indeed, I would not accept this conclusion, this premise rather, I would not accept this premise in the slightest. Right? The claim, yeah, non-human lives are more important than human lives, that's crazy, that's outlandish. You can have lots of people who accept this conclusion who would never accept that premise. Right? And so this premise violates the problematic premise fallacy, or sort of violates this rule. Right? And so then the argument as a whole commits the problematic premise fallacy. The premise just is unacceptable, uncredible, right? More controversial than the conclusion it was intended to establish. So like I said, this is probably the place where I see students run into the most trouble. So this would probably be a good context for people to maybe give some examples that you came up with, to try some arguments out, see if they work. So someone in the chat, Jessica, can you rewrite that as more of an argument exactly? Certainly abortion is an example of where we're going to see the problematic premise fallacy. That's entirely right. Can you maybe come up with, maybe turn that into sort of a more specific example, or a more specific argument rather? How about this one? Let me see if I can come up with one using abortion sort of as a framework. Because yeah, this is definitely a context where you will see problematic premise. Let's make just a super obvious one. Abortion isn't problematic because it's fine for anyone to murder anyone. For any reason. And you go, whoa, okay, something's gone wrong here, right? Because lots of people you might find who are indeed argue that abortions aren't morally problematic. Abortion is fine, abortion should be legal. And their reasoning is not because it's okay to murder anyone for any reason. Right? That's a way crazier claim, a way more controversial claim than the claim that abortion isn't problematic. Right? And so an argument that's sort of based upon this outlandish premise, yeah, if this is true, I guess there's no problem with abortion, but no one who's okay with abortion is okay with abortion for this reason. Right? And no one's gonna find this premise, that we should just murder anyone who we feel like acceptable. It's not going to be acceptable really to any audience. So was that maybe? I hope was that a helpful example that of maybe seeing this in the context of something like abortion as a debate. Any others anyone wants to try out? All right, then let's turn to our last two. People generally find these last two easier than a lot of the other ones we've been talking about. So these will be maybe some good ones to sort of end with. So let's do first what gets called the begging the question fallacy. This, you also might have heard this called a circular argument, and it's the same thing. So if you've heard it by that name, that's fine too. Same thing, same difference. This is any argument where the premise simply restates the conclusion in different words. And as a result of this, the premises just don't add anything new to the conclusion. They don't advance us past the conclusion. If you want to put it this way, it's sort of like P, therefore P. Right? And you kind of want to say to that, well, yeah, I guess, like if P is true, you mean it's kind of arguments that commit to begging the question fallacy are all actually deductively valid arguments, right? If P is true, then I suppose P is true, but I've been given no reason to believe that P is true. We just said P twice. We've repeated ourselves twice, right? Usually this is just a case where you just sort of like restate the conclusion in some different format. So let's look at an example. Hold on a second. It's not coming up. Come on, Zoom. There we go. I think it's working now. Yeah, okay. So we should raise taxes. It is really something that would be good to do. Right? It is really something that is good. That would be good to do. That's just what should means. That's just what should means. So we should raise taxes. It's really because it's something that would be good to do. We haven't added any new information. We've just said the same thing twice. Or maybe this box is really big because it's very large. We've just said the same thing twice. I've given you no reason to believe that the box is large, right? I've just repeated myself. And that's basically all of these begging the question arguments. That's basically what they're going to do. They're just going to repeat myself. You should believe that I'm telling the truth. Why? Well, because I'm telling the truth. We haven't gone anywhere. We've got circular, right? We've just gone in a circle, right? That's the logic of calling it a circular argument. Right? The premise just kind of restates the conclusion in other words. It doesn't actually give us reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. It also is kind of problematic premise fallacy, right? Like it's kind of like just as controversial as the conclusion is because it is the conclusion. It says the exact same thing that the conclusion says. Okay. So any questions with begging the question? Any questions begging the question? Any examples you might want to go for some more problems for begging the question? It doesn't have anything to do with just asking a question. That doesn't have really anything to do with that. It's sort of is begging the question. The word comes from some old-timey Latin stuff that we don't really need to work about. It's not about asking questions. It's about sort of like repeating the conclusion. Someone in the chat offered people should only drink Dasani water because Dasani is the best water. Yeah, that basically works. No real reason is being given for why you should drink Dasani water in that case. That one works. Teen birth rates are going up because more teens are getting pregnant. That's even better. That's our typical, right? You sort of like, what does it mean to say teen birth rates are going up? It means more teens are getting pregnant. That's a perfect example of restating the conclusion in different words. Yeah, that works perfectly. Good. Any others? All right, then let's end with our last fallacy. Not of the semester, but at least our last fallacy of chapter 4 anyway. So let's end with what gets called the false dilemma fallacy. A dilemma, by the way, is just an either-or statement in logic. So it's a term from propositional logic, actually. We didn't really look at sentences of this kind, but a dilemma is just kind of an either-or. So what's a false dilemma, then? A false dilemma is positing there's being some small set of options when there's really more option. And so basically, it's just an argument that contains a false either or sentence. That's actually basically what a false dilemma argument is. You might sort of, the either or might sound compelling. Maybe the either or sort of like, as we'll see in the example, like makes it you seem like a bad guy if you sort of take one of the two sides of it. So maybe that's why you might go along with it. But the premise is really just a false either or statement. It's an either or statement that's not really true. And so therefore the argument that's predicated upon that either or statement just isn't reliable. So an example that I came up with for this one, let's go. Either we raise taxes or we refuse to do anything to help those in poverty, thus we should raise taxes, right? And implicitly the logic here is you don't want to be like a cruel person who doesn't care about helping people who are poor. So therefore you have to go along with the other side of the dilemma. That's why these are called dilemmas. You either have to go this way or that way. You sort of are forced to choose between them. But this is a false dilemma. There's other options besides these two. Maybe we keep the rate of taxes the same and just rebalance our budget so that more money goes to public services. Maybe we could actually help those in poverty by lowering taxes. Maybe that's an option, right? And we don't need to say which of those options are correct. The problem here is just that this argument only presents these two options. There's more than just those two options. And so therefore the conclusion is just not reliable, right? Not a reliable either or statement, so therefore not a reliable conclusion. All right. So any examples people want to try out for false dilemma? Yep, good. We have a good one in the chat. Yep. If you don't like dogs, you're either a terrible person or just stupid. Perfect. That one works perfectly well. Right. There's, either this or that. And of course, you're supposed to be like, well, I'm not, I don't want to be a terrible person or stupid, so therefore I must like dogs. Perfect. Yep. Right. Whereas in fact, there could be many, maybe you're allergic to dogs. Right. There's many other possibilities that are getting left out. Yeah, that argument works perfectly well. And indeed, actually, you could say this is really, even though it looks like this argument's basically saying that there's three options: either you like dogs, you're terrible, or you're stupid. Right? And this goes to show it doesn't just have to be two options; it can be less options than there are in reality. So maybe there's 5 options. I say there's 5 options, but there's really 10. That's false dilemma too. Good. We have another one in the chat. So if you don't support abortion, you're a woman hater, thus you support abortion. Yep. That one works. I think actually someone just did basically the exact same argument together. Both of those I think work, right? We're saying there's basically, again, only 2 choices: either supporting women or supporting abortion, right? Or sorry, not support. Sorry, I said it backwards. Either supporting abortion or hating women, right? And indeed, there are more options than that. There's more possibilities, right? So it's a false either or dilemma. I think the other one is doing basically the exact same thing. And so yeah, good. Or maybe doing the opposite thing, but yes, the opposite thing to the same end, the same outcome. Good. Yeah, I think both of those work. Awesome. Any others? All right. Well, thank you all very much for flexibility today. Where I'm living, I still have about 3.5 feet of snow. And so I'm not going anywhere for a while. Hopefully for the Thursday class, I can maybe get there face to face. So thank you for your flexibility with doing this remotely today. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I've given you a bunch of practice problems to work on in preparation for the exam. The exam is pretty much just going to be identifying these fallacies. That's pretty much all it is. So the total of 14 of them that we've discussed throughout chapter 4. So do those homework problems. If you've run into questions, come to my office hours, and then the exam will be over the weekend. Same basic idea and format as normal. Remember, how you explain your answer is probably more important than the answer you give in a lot of places. So don't hesitate to come to office hours. Thank you all very much, and I will hopefully see you in person next week. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you.
You too.